Meredith, welcome to the Health Path podcast. It's really nice to be able to finally connect.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to meet you, Alex.
Likewise. And we've had some, I guess, a mutual friend on. Carrie Bennett's been on the podcast
Yeah.
before. So those of our listeners that are regular listeners will have an idea of what we're going to be discussing today, which is really this concept of quantum biology and a paradigm shift that seems to be happening. But before we dive
Yeah.
into that, are you happy to share a little bit about your own story for those people that might not be familiar with it yet?
Yeah, absolutely. And I like to share my story because I wasn't I got into all of this because I was suffering from what I came to understand was chronic fatigue. But it's an interesting sort of gray area that I think a lot of people are living in where I wasn't sick, right? Like I didn't have anything. I did lots of labs, which was super helpful, and most of them were good. And yet I had a low quality of life because I just could never have enough energy. So I think my story is important because that symptom of fatigue can lead to a lot of other things. And I feel quite lucky that I just was a person who, even though I was under some pressure not to just be like, oh, well, I guess I'm just really tired. Oh, well, I guess this is just modern life, to like maybe not be able to get through the day, to wake up feeling exhausted, even if you've slept for 10 hours, to like need to lie down. Like I would sometimes like lie down on the floor in the kitchen, or like I would have like a 5-minute nap. Like I became like an expert in just like letting my body shut down and then turn back on because I literally needed to reset it. I could feel it starting to crash. Um, but it was largely like my own intuition that refused to accept that, because all of the sort of professionals and all of the just casual advice that you'd get when you try to talk about it with someone. People like, oh, you have little kids, of course you're tired. And I just knew that it was more than that. And part of the reason I knew was that the things that usually help you feel not tired, like sleep or exercise, didn't make any difference. And in fact, exercise made me feel worse. So it occurred to me that there was something going on besides just um, having young children and being sleep deprived. Because when you're sleep deprived, when you catch up on your sleep, you feel better. And that was not the case. It just didn't matter. So I worked with someone who really focused on food. I did acupuncture. Saw my primary care physician. I saw, a woman who specialized in female hormones and all of these things. And no one could quite put a finger on it. So it was just largely um, a process of trial and error on my part. And when I started to learn about circadian rhythm and the toxic effects of blue light at night, that was a huge, huge piece of the puzzle, and really helped me to get to a place where I could live somewhat normally in terms of energy. And then I was like, why doesn't everyone know this? um, and so that started the sort of the journey of what I'm working on right now. But that was my personal sort of health story.
Mm. And how did you first sort of come across the sort of the circadian side of things?
It was an interview with Dr. Jack Cruz.
Okay.
So I was what I, listened to a lot of stuff. And uh, at the time I listened to a lot of personal development and spiritual stuff. And so he was a bit of an outlier guest for the host that I was listening to at the time. And she had him on. But what's interesting is that I listened to the interview because I sort of watched her stuff as it came out. And before I was in a health crisis. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. Like, probably makes sense to spend more time outside, whatever. Moved on. And it was only when I was in a moment where I felt really desperate. I was like, I don't know what else to do, right? I'm up against a wall. I can't micromanage my food any more than I already am. And if that was going to work, it would work. Like I felt so hopeless. Like nobody had any answers. And I just thought, I can't accept that. Like there has to be something I'm missing. This can't be true. Like I'm otherwise healthy. I'm in my, at the time I was in my 30s, like this, there has to be something else. And I flashed back to an interview in my mind. Like I just got really quiet and I'm like, okay, what is it? And I flashed back to this interview that I had already watched, but I came back to it in my moment of need. And it was like, oh, it was like I'd never heard a word. It hit me in a completely different way. And then I went like right down the rabbit hole.
I love that. I think it's so true that sometimes we can hear things that they don't land then and there for whatever reason. We're just not ready to absorb that information. But the time will come ultimately.
Yes. And it plants a seed.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, because we work with a lot of practitioners, and sometimes, they're like people aren't listening to me. And it's like, they may not be ready to act, but they're still hearing it, right? And so it's planting a seed that might bear fruit later on. You never know. Yeah.
How did you, once you had that sort of connection back to the podcast, what was sort of, I guess, some of the initial changes that you made, and what was that process like?
So it was actually quite slow because there was a part of my mind that was really holding on to this idea. And the idea was this: if this is true, if the light from my iPad and my phone and my television is this toxic, someone would have told me. I would have read about it in a newspaper. I would have heard about it somewhere. So this was back in like, I don't know, maybe 2017, 18, right? So at this point in time, maybe you would have seen it in those places. But at that time, and I had this idea that if it was really a scientific fact that that's what was happening, that this blue light was so toxic and derailing my circadian rhythm, and circadian rhythm is so important, and sunlight is not the enemy. And in fact, it's like a valuable nutrient that we all need. If those things were true, like I just thought I would have heard, I would have known. And so my mind had a hard time really accepting that this was true. And so I think my habit changes were a little bit slower as a result of that. However, once I did accept that, okay, like let's pretend it's true, what would I do? I ordered blue blocking glasses. I stopped reading my iPad before bed, which I didn't used to do. And then I started doing because somebody released an app that had like an entire bookstore in one app. And I was like, this is amazing. I can, because I'm like a book addict, right? So I thought it was so great. So I stopped reading. I moved my stack of books away and replaced it with my iPad. And my chronic fatigue got worse, which only in hindsight did I realize was because I switched from a soft bedside lamp to like this factory setting tablet. So I ordered blue blockers. I stopped doing that. If I did have bright lights on or wanted to watch television, I wore the blue blocking glasses. And I started going outside in the morning as soon as I woke up for a few minutes, even if it was 5 minutes. I just started that. So those were the two things that I started with. And they made a difference.
It's amazing, isn't it? That, as you say, such simple strategies can have such a powerful impact. And it seems to be a common theme. I was editing a conversation with Dr. Perry Nicholson today, and if you're not familiar with him, he does a lot around the lymphatic system. And a common comment he gets through some of his recommendations, which is just some very basic 5-10 second self-massage in 6 places in the body. People are like, if this is going to work, then why has no one told me this before? And it can't be this easy. And it seems to be just that's the way the mind works.
Yes. Yes. And we hear that a lot too, right? It's like, that's it. And I understand because, as we were just chatting about before we started recording, like the cases are getting so complex, like the chronic conditions layered on top of each other, and the symptoms are becoming more and more complex. So it feels like solutions should be equally complex. And it's a bit of a cognitive dissonance to realize that, yeah, these simple things, yeah, massaging, walking around outside, getting natural sunlight throughout the day, blocking artificial light at night, like they're not complicated. They don't really cost much money. Can get a pair of decent blue blockers for, like $30 US. Like, so that in itself, I think, is almost a barrier. It's like, what? That's it?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, it's compounded by the fact that we're being marketed to by, dozens and dozens of companies all the time, that there is this fancy, often expensive solution that is required. So in one situation, we're getting bombarded with that information. And then actually, we've got this subtle underlying truth that's starting to ripple through, which is actually, if we can reconnect with the laws of nature, we can have some of the most profound healing.
Yes.
So, what to you?
Well, I was just going to say that to me, a funny example of that is about a year ago, I think July 2022, the New York Times Magazine did a very in-depth cover story on circadian rhythm and how our bodies are filled with clocks. And they did a really nice job, actually, of breaking it down and explaining it, and interviewing some of the leading circadian researchers and highlighting like just how crucial circadian rhythms are to our overall health. And then the whole second half, then they started interviewing all of the pharmaceutical researchers who are trying to figure out how to control circadian rhythm with a pill. And I was like, really?
Wow.
You had me for the first few pages. We were right there with you, right? But yes, to your point, like why we would need a pill when you could just go outside, I don't know. But
yeah, no. And I guess that's a nice segue maybe into this concept today, which is quantum biology. So do you want to kind of just introduce this within what we're talking about?
Sure, because I would maybe just start by highlighting the difference between circadian rhythms and circadian biology and quantum biology. And circadian rhythm falls under the umbrella in our frame of reference that we use of quantum biology. And so circadian medicine is something that has been very deeply studied. It's won Nobel Prizes. It's come out in the last few years, as I was just saying, that to be one of the, if not the foundational controller of the systems in the body, right? So it used to just be like, I used to only think about circadian rhythm when I was traveling overseas and I would be jet lagged, right? And it's like, that was the only time people really needed to think about it, because you've got your light and dark cycles all mixed up. And for a long time, that was sort of how circadian rhythm was considered. And now the research has shown that actually circadian rhythm controls everything: our sleep, our digestion, our energy, our hormones, our cognitive functioning, our mood, like all of it. Circadian rhythm is foundational to that. Quantum biology takes it a step further and then says, okay, so how? Like, how are these photons of light interacting with the cells in our bodies? And so that's the step that's like a little bit out on the on the edge, so to speak, whereas the circadian piece is quite well established within mainstream medicine, even if it's not widely known. Whereas the idea of the quantum processes happening in the body, of the way that our cells interact with light, is I would say like sort of much more on the edge, and came through research that was done academically, nothing to do with human health, by Jim Al-Khalili and Joe McFadden. And they wrote a book called The Coming Age of Quantum Biology, and showed that birds migrate using quantum processes. Up till that point, it was considered impossible for quantum processes to happen in warm, wet environments, i.e. bodies of animals or people. So they showed that that's not true. Quantum processes do. And then I would credit Dr. Jack Kruse with making the link from that research to human health. And that is why we call it applied quantum biology, because we're taking that academic research and then applying it to in a practical way to human health.
Okay. So it's kind of, as you say, the how ultimately. What are the mechanisms that are connecting it?
Yes.
And I guess, I did a very short video for our YouTube channel very recently around sort of red light therapy, aka photobiomodulation or low level laser therapy. And the research there is it's amazing, because the study that I quickly shared was around Hashimoto's thyroiditis, so a thyroid autoimmune condition whereby, you shine a red light lamp that's got the right frequencies and you're seeing improvement in most parameters of thyroid function. And, as you know, Meredith, we could list a whole long list of studies showing us the benefits of red light therapy. So the evidence is just overwhelming that some of these tools, whether it's using natural light from full spectrum sunshine or using some of these kind of technologies that we now have, it's really fascinating, and it is, I think, paradigm shifting ultimately.
Yes, it is, and we're in the early stages of that, and it's it's tough because one of the I've interviewed over the last few years. I've interviewed many everybody I could find who had some level of expertise in this area, because I myself don't. I'm an executive coach and media person by background, so what I bring to the table is like, how do we organize this information in a way that it can be used, so that it's not just theoretical and it's not just random. And so I would ask everyone that I interviewed, when do you think that the idea that light affects health will be taught in, say, medical school or even naturopathic colleges? And they all said at least 20 years, right? Like at least 20 years from now, even though the science has been established at this point for almost 10 years, it was going to be another 20 or 30 before it would be part of the institutional system of learning that most professionals rely on.
Okay. Wow. And I guess that's in some ways to be expected.
Yeah.
In the sense that we know it takes years for research coming out today to be in clinical practice, but the cynic in me also wonders whether, because of the very nature of some of this information, that it's going to be even further delays.
Yes.
Ultimately, what are we saying? We're saying get outside, get your skin under the sun, etc. So there's not much to be gained from it.
Yeah. Yes, and there's not much to monetize in that advice. So it's slower to get picked up on, I think. And it's not, I don't want to be careful, it's not like a cure-all or anything, but it is foundational, right? Like I say to people, if you were eating gummy worms for breakfast and dinner, you might not, whatever's going wrong might not be cured by switching to real food, but it would definitely help, right? And it's the same way with light. Like looking at a phone or a computer, even a television, it's slightly better, so it's a bit farther away, but like putting that blue light on our eyes and our skin at night, it's it's the same thing as eating like a coffee sundae sprinkled with cocaine, right? Like it's that bad. Like it's an absolutely toxic signal for our system. It throws our entire bodies into chaos, because the circadian research started with discovering that there's a clock in our eye, but then it went on to discover that there's clocks in every cell of our body. So when we throw that system into chaos, we get chaotic results, which start with inflammation and fatigue and grow from there.
Yeah. I think the way I view it these days, from listening to the likes of Dr. Kruse and Carrie Bennett, is, as you say, I call it a sort of a prerequisite ultimately. because you can be doing so much right in so many other areas. But
Yeah.
if you are staying up late, if you are on technology late, etc., then it's really is a bit of a blocker to be in sort of optimal health. And it's a little bit sort of generalized, but this idea that true health is when our bodily systems are working in synergy, doing what they're meant to be doing at the right time. And that is foundational for a living organism. And the light is the cue ultimately for that.
Beautiful. Yes. Yeah. A colleague of ours, Dr. Gutierrez, he says, yeah, the light is like the conductor of the symphony, right? And the symphony is made up of all the cells in our body. So if you have a conductor come on stage who's drunk, right? Like you're not going to have a coherent sound coming out. It's going to sound, you think about when a symphony is playing together versus when they're warming up and it's all discordant and there's things different notes all over the place, versus when they're playing in a coherent manner. That's the light, and that's the role of light in our lives. And so to try and even diagnose somebody, I think, when their circadian rhythms are totally dysregulated, it's very difficult to know what's actually needs addressing versus what is just a result of that, just of that circadian dysfunction.
Yeah, and I guess to give people context in regards to like where we are at within this kind of paradigm shift that's very slowly going to be happening. It's not considered really, is it? Within sort of research, within labs, if we go and do some labs, they don't really take into consideration circadian or circannual rhythms. And some of the thing that really fascinates me is you can go and do a cortisol test, and the reference range isn't going to shift based on the month or season that you do it in. But in theory, it very much should do, because we know that that's going to shift things ultimately.
Yes. Yeah. All of the things that we do would be affected by it. Yeah. Everything that we measure. So a practitioner who understands that, which is why we offer practitioner training, can then order the labs and look at them through that lens, right?
Oh, wow. Okay.
Right. Like they could, because they have that understanding, they would know. They would bring that to the table. And so the labs are still helpful if the person ordering them got some guidance around that.
Yeah. I think that's it. I think most labs, the value comes in the capacity to be able to interpret the data correctly.
Yes.
So I guess with
Yes.
that in mind, do you want to discuss a little bit about what's going on? Because we have a lot of practitioners that listen to the podcast. So what's out there? If practitioners are keen to sort of learn more around quantum biology, what's happening on the street?
So it's early days. We have a certification. Carrie Bennett is one of our faculty. Dr. Leland Stillman is one of our faculty. And we've spent the last few years building a curriculum that sort of covers the scientific foundations as well as the practical applications. But it's really one of those moments in time where, you have to find the voices that have studied the material and then put it into practice and then worked with it. So I've tried very hard to bring those voices together into a community so that we can start to build some momentum around this field. And we created the certification and got it accredited so that it has some authority and people have something to hold on to. I was really informed by the work of Thomas Kuhn, who talks about scientific revolutions and paradigm changes. And his point of view is that if you don't have a paradigm, like a framework, then you just have a long list of facts and discoveries and interesting things, which is sort of where we were at a few years ago, right? You had Gerald Pollack's work with structured water. You had Doug Wallace saying, actually, everything's about mitochondria. You had, Mei Wan Ho and all of these people doing all of this, Gilbert Ling, all of this amazing, interesting, fascinating work that showed that the body actually works in a completely different way than we think that it does. But there wasn't like a coherent framework until, in my opinion, the Khalili and McFadden coined the term quantum biology. And then it's like, oh, okay, so that brings this thread together, and that brings that thread together, and that explains this. And it gives you, like a bookshelf to put things on, as opposed to have it being just spread out all over. So I think we're at the like very, 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 very beginning stages of this being a thing, to put it in a very highly articulate term.
Right.
And so it's really just drawing in people and attracting people who, what I hear most is like, I just have this feeling that something's missing, right? And to your point earlier, cases and conditions are getting more complex, and things that used to work aren't working, or aren't working as well. And it's like, as our environment becomes more complex, we have like, in the US, they just banned light bulbs, incandescent light bulbs. So just,
Oh, wow.
ridiculous. Yeah. So we have bad light, we have all of the, Wi-Fi, we have all of the 5G, we have all, our bodies are coming under assault in more and more intensely, sort of every couple of years as the technology ramps up. So it makes sense that a practitioner or a person's ability to reconcile their symptoms is getting harder. But what quantum biology does is gives us a reason why, right? It's like the environment that our bodies are trying to exist in keeps changing and changing, but it's all invisible, and we don't think about it from a sort of biochemical Newtonian framework, has no answers for that. So it just seems overwhelming and crazy and weird. But when you look at it through the quantum biologic lens, it's like, oh, it actually makes perfect sense, because all of these frequencies are having an effect on our body, and we're throwing our bodies into this increasingly complicated and stressful environment without understanding that that's what's going on.
Yeah. Okay. That does make more sense. And I think as soon as you start thinking that really our health is determined by the environment, then we can start to appreciate maybe at a deeper level why the message around quantum biology and circadian biology is just sort of so paramount ultimately. Because I think, for so long, it's not that it's wrong, but it's only a piece of the puzzle. This idea, it starts in the gut, or chronic fatigue is because of the Epstein-Barr virus. It's like there's partial truth to all of these common understandings, but ultimately, if we're going to be in vibrant health, we need to be in an environment that's in vibrant health, because that is the interface of all of this. So we have to think about light as the foundational reason why there's life on this planet.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And that's why, there's also like the piece, right, where we've sort of been trained, especially in the last 20 to 30 years, to really fear the sun. Right. And, another one of our board members is a cardiologist, Dr. Michael Twyman. And he says, like, if sunlight was bad for humans, we wouldn't be here, right? Like we evolved under the sun. We need it. We are, in a way, from a quantum biologic perspective, we're photosynthetic beings, and we need to interact with that sun. And yet we've somehow, I'm by the, nearby the lake, and we go down to the lake where we are in the summer, right? And I see everybody's out there enjoying the sun, but they've got on sunglasses, and they've got a hat, and they've slathered in SPF 50, and they're and not, you do obviously want to have safe sun exposure. Getting burned's not a great idea, but it's like the sun is the enemy has become, viewed as like a healthy way to think about things, and it's completely backward.
Yeah. And I think, some of the statistics that have been coming out, I'm not sure if it's the World Health Organization, but someone's kind of put the stat out that we spend 90% of our lives inside.
Yeah.
It is being said to be a public health crisis in regards to our kind of lack of sunshine ultimately. So you can see sort of the shift starting, and certainly more and more people becoming aware of the need for this. And just so I get it into the podcast, I think I noticed a huge shift in my just overall health and well-being when I was consistently getting outside at sunrise and basically spending as much time as I could outside. And it's hard to put into words. I mean, I was forced to because my son just got up at sunrise in the summer.
Perfect.
4 in the morning, but I took advantage.
Yeah.
We spent a lot of time outside, and it has to be said, the only way I can describe it is there was almost a spiritual shift, because my relationship with light just utterly changed. And it's very hard to put into words, but I would absolutely crave natural full spectrum sunlight. I would see it in a different way. I would see bits of light that I wouldn't have been aware of previously. And it was a fascinating kind of journey to go on. It was almost like I was I don't know, maybe connecting to something very primal that's, in our DNA, which obviously it very much ultimately is when we think of how we evolved, as you say, as photosynthetic beings. But I just encourage everyone now to just spend as much of your time outside as possible. And Carrie does a great job of, I think, giving us recommendations for when that's not as possible. Most of us work 40-hour plus weeks, we work inside jobs, but when you have the window open, etc., etc., there are things that we can do just to try and improve that light environment, which will help our systems kind of get coherent again. But for me, the most surprising thing, I think, was the relationship with light that I started to develop. It was a really interesting one.
That's beautiful, Alex. I love that story. And yeah, I had the same experience. And it's there's, you almost feel like this, like when you see somebody you really care about, you haven't seen in a long time, and you're like, oh, how did I go so long without seeing this person? It feels like that in a way. It like sort of coming home, like your body, especially those early morning hours, those first couple of hours of sunlight. I still like to sleep a lot, so don't always make sunrise during the summer when it's really early, but I do get out within an hour of it. And yes, just that awareness of where we exist in time and space, and what's happening with the natural cycles of light and dark, and noticing the quality of the light and how it changes over the course of the day, and how filters through the trees, and what it feels like, especially early in the morning. It does, I think, have an incredibly spiritual component, and is an incredible mood enhancer. I had a similar experience you had with your son, where, my husband and I have been practicing this for years, but just, as you were saying, like life and things, we would go outside at sunrise, especially during the school year, and like stand there for a few minutes, and then I'd go and do what I needed to do in the kitchen, and I'd open all the windows, but that was sort of the thing. And I just had this strong sense that it wasn't enough. So we got a puppy, and the puppy wakes up, within a half hour of sunrise, and we take her out for a walk in the woods, and our time outside went from like 10 minutes to 40 minutes. And yeah, it was transformational. My energy for the whole day felt different. My mind, my state of mind felt different, the way starting my day. And I wasn't even trying. It just happens, right? Like there's something about that light that we just need, and fulfills us on a very deep level.
Yeah. And I remember saying, I'm thinking back to the last year when I was literally it must have been 3 months every morning out there sort of at sunrise. And it generally did feel like the battery was charging.
Yeah.
I speak to clients, and I was speaking to someone the other day, and they literally said, I think I'm solar powered, and they have no idea of quantum biology, circadian rhythms yet, but we still have this
Oh,
understanding that, oh my God, how much better do I feel?
yeah.
Like we all know it.
Yeah.
But for many reasons, I guess we've kind of been disconnected with that idea.
Right. Oh, I love that. And yeah, that's what happens is like that person just made an intuitive connection
Yeah,
because you don't need to understand any of this. And I certainly, I'm not a science person. I don't understand it at a deep level in terms of like the mechanisms and all that kind of thing. But and you don't need to. I think like having a general idea, like maybe removing the idea that the sun is your enemy, but then, yeah, these intuitive impulses start to happen that, uh, and I think we become much more sensitive. We become much more uh, connected to our thoughts and our healthy impulses, and all kinds of things arise. Our dreams become more vivid. And it's there's a feeling that it's like, oh, like this is what we're supposed to feel like, right? I mean, being in denial about chronic fatigue is like a pretty extreme example, but even just on a day-to-day basis, when people are like, oh no, I'm fine, I feel okay. It's like we really mostly don't when we realize what it's actually possible to feel like. Maybe not 100% of the time. I don't like to make, impossible standards for people. But even just for a day here and there or certain moments here and there, uh, it's quite life-changing.
it is definitely. And I think the best advice that certainly I can give is to just encourage people to give it a go. Because I
Yeah.
think all of these things, if you can experience it yourself, and that's the best evidence we're going to have. And I don't think it takes long to start to really notice shifts. And what you said around things like dreaming, I definitely noticed that, and I definitely found that sleep has always been one of my weak links, all of my life. But I was falling asleep so well, and you could say it's because I was
Wow.
obviously up at half four. That's,
Yeah.
but I honestly think it was also because I was just thinking of the light environment. And
Mhm.
anyone that's listened to our episodes with the likes of Carrie knows um, the role that that infrared light at sunrise and sunset plays as a real kind of environmental cue for what time of day it is. And then, if, as you said at the beginning, if we're using things like our blue light blocking glasses, we can really start to have a profound impact on our sleep. Um,
Yeah.
and actually, I haven't shared this, I don't think, before, but I remember, gosh, it must have been probably 2014. It was on a flight to a functional medicine conference in the US, and I was reading a magazine, and there was an article around a woman who had, I don't know, I can't remember the diagnosis, but basically she had an actual condition around circadian dysfunction, and it was kind of one of those extreme diagnoses where her sleep pattern is completely random. So sometimes she'll have to be sleeping at midday, sometimes it'll be 5 p.m. There's just no synchronicity there whatsoever. And the thing that got her circadian rhythm back from memory was traveling across the United States, sleeping in a tent, and essentially
Mm,
being grounded a lot more. And she
right.
found that that complete lack of sort of artificial night,
Yeah.
living by purely really natural sunlight, and she started to notice her circadian rhythm really started to kind of kick back in. And from memory, I don't know why I remember this, but she was traveling across the US to meet a partner she had met online with the same condition, who also started having improvements practices. So that's kind of like almost my first taste of kind of circadian shift.
Wow. What a fabulous story. That's so great.
Yeah, I need to try and find it
Yeah.
because it was beautiful.
Yeah. That's
I think it's
yeah.
a good example that even in with someone with such an extreme condition, that actually that's the power of nature ultimately.
Yes, and it's really about it's a, mostly a process of elimination, right? Like it's taking away the things that are cutting us off
Right.
from who we're supposed to be and how we're supposed to be. Like if there's a fish floundering in a puddle, right, you throw it into deep water and it's like, oh, okay, right. Like that's what we're doing. That's what we need to do to ourselves. And so, yeah, but you take, when you're camping, you've taken away all of the barriers. It's just you and nature. So you're getting those inputs, and it's like your body, like we were saying earlier, can operate in a coherent way. And it's not, it's not fighting. So every one of those things is a stressor. And so modern life, like we can't, we're not going to get rid of them all. But if we know what they are, we can be, mindful about choosing when and how we use those things, and make sure that our, I think of it as like restorative time for my cells, right? Like when do they get a chance to just be in their, be a fish in water and just be in the natural environment and not be bombarded with things that they have to fight with.
Yeah, I like that idea. The idea of, the environment the cells are bathing in, and trying to just make sure that input is as optimal as possible. Is there anything else, Meredith, that you would like to share? Anything that we haven't touched on yet?
I mean, you did mention sleep, and I do just want to share, because as somebody who, when we started off, I talked about having, getting like 10 hours of sleep a night and still feeling tired. So I do think it's worth explaining a little bit like what that blue light is doing to our sleep, which is suppressing the melatonin. And melatonin, there's been a huge amount of research on how essential it is, I'm sure to health, cancer prevention, I mean, just everything. And so the melatonin comes out. I like to work in metaphors. So the metaphor I like the best is like that when we go to sleep, we go into the process of autophagy, and that's where our cells clean and repair themselves, like running the dishwasher. Except in this dishwasher, if a dish is cracked, it will fix itself in the dishwasher. And the melatonin allows that process to happen. So the blue light is stopping, right? It's like turning on the dishwasher, but without any water or soap. Like it's still running. So we're still asleep. But the piece that makes that sleep restorative and health giving and life giving is diminished the more our light environment is discordant with our circadian needs.
Oh, nice. And yeah, as you say, the research coming out on melatonin is it's just incredible. I think we had Deanna Minich come on and do a webinar for our practitioners a couple of weeks ago, and she's coming onto the podcast in a couple of weeks' time to kind of share some of the research that she's been doing around it. But I didn't realize until recently that she said that the gut has, we think, 400 times the amount of melatonin than the pineal gland does, I think she says.
Wow.
Which is quite an interesting statistic, and gets you thinking about the role that the gut and the gut microbiome potentially play within some of this. I know there's a little bit of discussing the microbiome as a factor within sort of entraining circadian rhythms as well, and I guess that fits in with time restricted feeding as another environmental cue here.
Yes, yeah, the food would be another circadian input, and so evolutionarily our systems program themselves to stop digesting when it got dark. So to eat when it's dark and to eat close to bedtime also dysregulates our circadian systems. So yeah, it's best to eat dinner light and early when possible. And yeah, the other thing that I would say too is that, every little bit helps, right? Like if you're not in a place where you can go for a 40-minute walk as soon as you wake up, like crack a window, and go out on the balcony for a minute, go out on the front porch for a few minutes. Every minute of natural light is supporting health. So cracking the car window, opening the sunroof, all of those things matter. You can start with small steps.
I think that's an important point. And I mean, are you aware of any data in regards to, is there a known minimum sort of input? Or is at this point, can we just say, even if it's a minute, let's just get outside as soon as we can for as long as we can ultimately?
Yeah, I think a couple minutes would probably be the minimum. But all of the faculty who teach on our certification are like, if you start with 2 minutes, and they all have different backgrounds, so they do have different opinions on different things, but on that they are quite unanimous that even 2 minutes outside as soon as you wake up makes a difference, even if it's not sunrise, even if it's later in the day. And in fact, just starting to go outside in the morning and blocking the blue light at night will make it easier to get up in the morning. And so it becomes less difficult to push that wake up time if you just start where you're at. Cool. Yeah. And from a practitioner perspective, we talk about this a lot in the coaching calls in our program. It's like, yeah, just to meet people where they're at. And we might have, in mind a high bar of what they really need, but even just starting out with whatever they can do is a huge win.
Yeah.
And they will, what tends to happen is that, like, the power of light is so incredible. I mean, as we've talked about, as I've experienced, that even those little actions tend to bring about enough progress that people are like, oh, you weren't kidding. Because that does happen, right? Like, it's, as we were saying, it seems so simple. Sometimes people just won't do it because they don't even believe. But then once they do, the effects of it are so usually immediate, right? Like, you could reset your circadian rhythm in 3 days. I mean, I'm not saying you can reset your symptoms in 3 days, but you can go from being dysregulated to regulated within a few days of just being very mindful of your light environment. And the feelings that come with that, of the feeling good, like we talked about, like that relief, and they're like, oh, I don't feel like such a basket case. I don't have all this brain fog. Like, I'm not just like, oh, like groggy and those types of results tend to come pretty quickly. And so once you get that feeling of like, oh my gosh, there's something to this.
Yeah. No, it's a good point because you hear people talk about starting to wear blue light blocking glasses, and almost immediately certain, sometimes subtle symptoms, but things improve. Either they feel sort of, some people feel more relaxed as soon as they start wearing them, or things like eye strain if you wear some during the day. There are things like that can happen almost immediately. So as you say, again, it's giving people very quick feedback that this is something to continue to just chip away at and make little inroads as and when you can.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that feeling of relief, like, it's quite profound once we start noticing. And then when you, like, I have the software on my computer called Iris that takes out a lot of the blue light that I have on even during the day, right? And when my computer resets, sometimes the software like gets shut off, and the computer goes back to factory settings for a few seconds, and I'm just like, oh my God, I used to sit in front of this for hours at a time. Like, it's shocking how intense it is, and how once you're used to mitigating it, when you put yourself in front of it, you can feel the stress reaction in your body, in your eyes, in your, like, everything is like, oh, and we just got used to it. So it's quite a journey.
Yeah, it is. And I think it can be somewhat of an addictive journey in like a positive sense, that because you are seeing those improvements in health, and that relationship with light may be changing things. Like, I certainly found that I was just wanting kind of more and more of that.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's nice that you can have that kind of relationship with those sort of lifestyle changes that are being made as well.
Yes.
I think we've
Yeah,
sold
it's
it.
fun. Pardon?
I think we've sold it pretty well.
I think we have. Yeah. Because I mean, I personally like hated the food stuff. I love to eat, but I hate thinking about it. I've got more of like an ADD type mind, and like lists and shopping and making sure I had of all these very, very specific things and very, very specific amounts. Like, it made me want to cry. And so when it was like, I could get more health benefits by taking off my shoes and walking around on the grass for 10 minutes, playing with the children outside, like, it was just such a relief. I'm like, oh, the health journey it can be fun, life-giving, life-enhancing. There's joy in it.
Yes, and that's such a key part to it, I think. I remember saying, actually, on the very first podcast, Health Path podcast, I spoke with Richard, who is the CEO. And we talked about, I guess, almost energetically, healing. It needs to have a sense of expansiveness and abundance and flow. And I think oftentimes it's not that it's wrong or an incorrect way to do it, but a lot of the strategies and interventions out there can often feel quite constricting, restricting. And with that, for a lot of people, can come a degree of anxiety, frustration, hypervigilance. So again, it's another reason why I think we always have to sort of feel into some of these things, and get a sense of, how does this feel for me? And I think with light, it generally does feel much more the former rather than the latter.
Yes. And that's such an important part, because that kind of the restrictive approach, the hypervigilant approach, the dogmatic approach, they're not sustainable, right? Like, we can't live in that place on a long-term basis. So perhaps for a certain period of time, a person might need to have a very specific type of diet, right? But to just be like, okay, no, that's it. You have to eat like that for the rest of your life, or you're in trouble, right? Like, it can't feel like a burden, because at a certain point, we're going to need to shake that burden off. It has to sort of become part of the fabric of who we are. And spending time outside is a pretty fun, easy way. Right. And on that note, that's also what I so love about quantum biology, is that it explains all of these things that you were just saying, that like the importance of joy, the importance of an expansive, coherent approach to things. Quantum biology can explain why, on a frequency level, that's having a physical impact on our human health. Whereas up to this point, there were the woo-woo people who's like, of course, quantum processes are happening in living systems, but like, can you explain how? Well, no. And then there are the people who are like, that's quackery. And now this work is a bridge to show that, in fact, all of these things matter, but also how they matter, like how exactly, what the mechanism is of how they affect the body.
Brilliant. Yeah, it's exciting times.
Really is. Really is. We are living through some really interesting moments.
Yes, we are indeed. Meredith, thank you so much for sparing an hour to come and speak with me. It's really nice to be able to connect, sort of in person, so to speak.
For sure.
And hear your journey and what's going on within the quantum biology world.
Oh, well, thanks so much. And thanks for, making a contribution to the world to help people have agency and on their health journey. It's very needed and important.